distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Now I'm standing here to welcome our speaker. On this occasion, we are celebrating the 152nd birth anniversary of our founder, Anagarika Dharmapala. In this year, for this keynote speech, I have invited to our Director, Mr. Sugeeshwara Gunaratna, the Deputy High Commissioner for Sri Lanka in the UK. I would like to say a few words in order to introduce our speaker. You know very well him, but it is a custom for me. Sugeeshwara Gunaratna joined the Sri Lanka Foreign Service in year 2000 and has served as Councillor, Political and Media at the Sri Lanka High Commission in New Delhi. He has also served as Second Secretary at the Permanent Mission of Sri Lanka to the United Nations in Geneva, handling human rights and humanitarian affairs. Prior to assuming duties in his current position, he served as Director to the United Nations Multilateral Affairs, Human Rights and Conferences Division at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He had also served previously as Deputy Director at the South Asia and SAARC Division in the ministry. He is graduate from the University of Colombo, Sri Lanka, and has postgraduate qualification in corporate communications and public relations from Centennial College, Toronto, Canada, and in development studies from the University of Colombo, Sri Lanka. He has contributed speeches and articles, some of which are available online, to UN forums, as well as newspapers and magazines in India and Sri Lanka. Today, he will be speaking on the topic, the contemporary relevance of the legacy of Anagarika Dharmapala and its contribution to the spread of Buddhism. Thank you.
Venerable Ogada Siddharimada Nayakathero, Chief Sanganayaka of Great Britain, venerable members of the clergy, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I am most humbled and privileged by this invitation to deliver the keynote address on the occasion of the 90th anniversary of the founding of the London Buddhist Vihara. Today, September 17, 2016, also marks exactly 152 years since the birth of one of Sri Lanka's greatest sons and founder of this Vihara. My first memory of Anagarika Dharmapala was a family account by my father and other elders. This was a story of some family members, including my father, going to India in the mid-60s to escort back to Sri Lanka a close relative who had fallen ill. His name was Deva Priyavalisinghe, the then General Secretary of the Mahabodhi Society and the chief disciple of Anagarika Dharmapala. Thereafter, it was in school that I learned of the heroic efforts of Anagarika Dharmapala in resuscitating Sinhala nationalism and Buddhist identity at a time when the people in Sri Lanka, through colonial subjugation, were afraid and somewhat embarrassed to call themselves Sinhala or Buddhist. We have heard of the words Buddha Gayava Beraganiu, or Save Buddha Gaya, the clarion call of Anagarika Dharmapala. We have heard of his enormous efforts of sacrifice in resuscitating the venues of Buddhist worship in India and help India rediscover its Buddhist heritage. We have heard of his efforts in rekindling anti-colonial sentiment and rejuvenating Sinhala Buddhist consciousness in Sri Lanka. However, this Vihara is living testimony to something much more. It is testimony to the fact that the influence of the life and work of Anagarika Dharmapala goes much beyond the Indian subcontinent and Sri Lanka. When Anagarika Dharmapala was born in 1864, the teachings of the Buddha were largely unknown beyond the traditionally Buddhist countries of Asia. Moreover, Buddhism and its traditions were virtually forgotten in the land of its birth, along with the dereliction and destruction of Buddhist places of worship. Buddhists in Sri Lanka were subject to many forms of harassment and discrimination at the hands of the then colonial administrators. Anagarika Dharmapala, through his sheer dedication and indefatigable efforts, not only restored Buddhist places of worship in India and led a Buddhist revival in his home country, but propagated the sublime message of the Buddha far beyond the confines of Asia and into the countries of the West. Today in the West, there are a number of institutions dedicated to the teaching and practice of the Dhamma. Mindfulness meditation has become the new vogue among those seeking a way out of the stress and anxieties of modern life, as well as those realizing the futility of attempts at endless indulgence of sensory pleasures. Mindfulness-based stress reduction programs based on Buddhist practices are gaining wide acceptance as exemplified in the seminal work of John Kabat-Zinn of the University of Massachusetts in his work, Full Catastrophe Living. Mindfulness-based cognitive therapy techniques have been developed by 3 scientists from the universities of Oxford, Cambridge, and Toronto to help those suffering from depression build resilience. The UK Parliamentary Committee on Mindfulness declared in its report of October 2015 that, and I quote, "Mindfulness is one of the most promising prevention strategies and is regarded as popular and non-stigmatizing, unlike some other mental health interventions." The report also goes on to declare that 72% of GPs here in the UK want to refer patients to mindfulness courses on the NHS, although access to courses remains an issue. Buddhist meditators have been declared by researchers who analyze their brain activity as the happiest people on earth. The term happiest man alive was made famous by Matthew Ricard, a French scientist turned Tibetan Buddhist monk who subjected himself to tests on brain activity conducted by the University of Wisconsin-Madison and scored significantly higher than the average of hundreds of other volunteers. Fritjof Capra, in his books Tao of Physics and The Turning Point, talks of the connections between Eastern mysticism and modern physics and calls for a more coherent, holistic, and ecological approach to dealing with contemporary issues, respecting the harmonious interrelationship between us and nature. This realization and interest in the Western world in Buddhism, as well as other practices of the Shramana tradition such as yoga, stems from a realization that while we are perhaps the most physically comfortable humans ever, human well-being and satisfaction have eluded us. It stems from a realization that there is something fundamentally wrong with our yardsticks of success. As such, we live in times of great contradictions. We try to create world peace without creating peaceful human beings. We talk of environmental sustainability after measuring our success by our ability to consume more from the environment. Space and time have constricted due to the communication gadgets we use and our transportation capabilities, but we have less time for each other. Our education systems are geared to garner knowledge of this world and to use a multitude of gadgets to exploit it. But still, hardly do we know the most sophisticated gadget on this planet, the human mind. While we have been successful at discriminating and analyzing, we have been less successful at seeing the world in a holistic manner. It is this progressive realization that there is something fundamentally wrong in our approach in creating well-being, coupled with the improved level of access to the teachings of the Shramana tradition, that many in the West are beginning to explore alternatives with renewed interest in the teachings of the Buddha. The beginning of this modern interest in Buddhism can be traced back to the work of Anagarika Dharmapala, the Mahabodhi Society, and the Theosophical Society. Its origins lie in the great debates that took place in Sri Lanka in the 1860s between the Buddhist and Christian sides, culminating in the Panadura debate of 1873 and its translation into English. This translation was read by an American, Colonel Henry Steele Olcott of the Theosophical Society, who came to Sri Lanka in 1880 along with Madame Blavatsky, both of whom had by then acquired a degree of fame in the Western world through the work of the Theosophical Society. Colonel Olcott and Madame Blavatsky, joining forces with the young Anagarika Dharmapala, added the greatest fillip to the Buddhist revivalist movement. Thereafter, Anagarika Dharmapala set up the Mahabodhi Society in 1891 to fight for the restoration of Buddhist shrines in India, including Buddha Gaya. Anagarika Dharmapala's addresses as the only Theravada Buddhist representative to the World's Parliament of Religions in 1893 in Chicago formed an important part of its deliberations. The significance of this conference is captured by C.F. Rasweiler in his work, The World Congress of Religions at the World Columbian Exposition, and reads as follows, and I quote, "This great religious gathering, never possible before in the history of the world, nor even now perhaps possible anywhere else than in the great city by the unsalted sea, was inaugurated in the Art Palace on Monday, September 11, 1893, and continued for 18 days. All nations, tribes, and tongues assembled in the hall of Columbus. The Orient and the Occident clasped hands. From India's coral strand, from Japan and China clad in robes of white and red and orange, the Oriental priests mingled with the sober-clad representatives of the West to explore paths leading to religious harmony and the well-being of all mankind. An extraordinary cordiality prevailed as delegates clasped their hands warmly in spite of being perfect strangers. The cosmopolitan representatives from all over the world gave the 4,000 spectators a spectacular picture never seen before on earth. From Sri Lanka, the representative was H. Dharmapala. This conference, which was an important conference in the 19th century, which contributed to the revival and resuscitation of Western interest in ancient religions, was skillfully used by Anagarika Dharmapala to gain international acceptance of his movement. His lecture, entitled "The World's Debt to the Buddha," attracted the attention of the intellectual elite in the West. Another important lecture was on the topic Theosophy, its relation to Eastern religions. His influence on the deliberations is captured in the St. Louis Observer of Chicago of September 21, 1893, and it reads as follows. With his black curly locks thrown back from his broad brow, his keen, clear eyes fixed upon the audience, his long brown fingers emphasizing the utterances of his vibrant voice, he looked the very image of a propagandist, and one trembled to know that such a figure stood at the head of the movement to consolidate all the disciples of Buddha and to spread the light of Asia throughout the civilized world. The Chicago Journal, commenting on his role at the conference, stated that contempt and pity for the Oriental religions have given way to respect and admiration. It was also on his way back from Chicago that Anagarika Dharmapala met Mary Foster, the descendant of a Hawaiian king, and to whom the Buddhist world owes a great debt of gratitude for her magnanimity to the propagation of the Dhamma. For many Buddhist institutions in India and Sri Lanka, as well as the London Buddhist Vihara, were built with her money. Thus, the first building of the Vihara in Ealing was rightly called Foster House. For us in Sri Lanka today, as we continue to engage in the task of post-conflict nation building, the work of Anagarika Dharmapala holds special meaning. The Buddhist revivalist movement he created laid the foundations for Sri Lanka's independence from colonial subjugation and instilled a strong sense of patriotism and nationalism in our people. He abhorred violence and always sought to create men of character in keeping with Buddhist principles. The institutions he founded and the Buddhist schools that he pioneered continue to mold generations of patriotic citizens who have stood by and helped the nation overcome many formidable challenges. It is worthwhile to remember that more often than not, when we contemplate how modern societies overcame injustices and progressed, it is evident that successes were in large part due to the ability to appeal to a universal sense of humanity, justice, and tolerance, reaching beyond the confines of one's core audience, while standing firm on one's foundations. This gave these movements a moral high ground above their detractors, as evident in the endeavors of Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi, or Nelson Mandela. Similarly, Anagarika Dharmapala, with his formidable intellect and ability to decipher vexed philosophical questions with clarity, was able to attract and sustain the support of non-Buddhist leaders, both in India and the West. Formidable scholars and spiritual leaders of the day, such as Edwin Arnold, Swami Vivekananda, Dr. Kalidas Nag, Rahul Sanskrityayana, and others, as well as the leaders of the Indian independence movement, assisted the Buddhist revivalist movement begun by Anagarika Dharmapala. The German-born British scholar Max Muller, in a letter to Anagarika Dharmapala dated January 17, 1899, states that, and I quote, "I was always pleased to belong to a society to which you belong. You have been and are doing such good work that I hope you may be successful in your college in Colombo. Though I am not a Buddhist, I can join in many of your prayers, and I consider revival of Buddhist morality a great blessing for the great mass of people in Ceylon and India also." Ladies and gentlemen, my speech would not be complete if I do not elaborate a little on the work of Anagarika Dharmapala's chief disciple, Brahmachari Devapriya Valasinha, about whom I mentioned at the beginning of my speech. The Shakespearean adage from the 12th Night states, "Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. They divide the great in this world into three categories. Yet, there are also those who fulfill the conditions of greatness in the literary sense of the word, but do not seek the limelight nor bask in its glory. On occasion, limelight finds them for brief, flirtatious moments, but for the most part, the story of history is confined to the leaders. The steady workhorses who help build the legacy of a pioneer have to be content with being a detail. Devapriya Valasinha was one such son of Sri Lanka, who was the loyal disciple behind the success of Anagarika Dharmapala's missionary efforts. Having been involved with the work of the Mahabodhi Society since the 1920s, Devapriya Valasinha took on the burden after the passing away of his teacher in 1933 and continued the struggle to save Buddha Gaya. When the ashes of Anagarika Dharmapala were taken to Ceylon by Devapriya Valasinha and Raja Heva Vitarana, it is reported that a crowd of around 50,000 gathered at Malika Kandu. Valasinha inspired the entire audience to take a pledge that they would not rest until Buddha Gaya was restored to Buddhists as a tribute to the memory of Anagarika Dharmapala. The Indian National Congress had appointed a committee headed by Dr. Rajendra Prasad, who later became the first president of India, to look into the Bodh Gaya question. Devapriya Valasinha often represented Anagarika Dharmapala as a member of this committee and also helped write certain parts of this report. It was based on the recommendation of this committee that the Bihar State Parliament in 1949 adopted the Bodh Gaya Temple Management Act, which deemed that the site would be managed by a body consisting of 4 Buddhists, 4 Hindus, and the district magistrate of Gaya. This is the arrangement that remains to date. Devapriya Valasinha's involvement in the restoration of the Mulagandhi Kuti Vihara in Sarnath, the site of the first sermon, his continuous perseverance to bring back the relics of Arahant Sariputta and Arahant Moggallana from the Victoria and Albert Museum in London for enshrinement in India, which happened in 1949. His association with the likes of Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar, thus influencing the Dalit Buddhist movement in India, as well as his lifelong contribution to the work of the Mahabodhi Society, are well documented in the journals of the Mahabodhi Society. I personally am privy to a large body of letters written by Anagarika Dharmapala to Devapriya Valasinha. which were in the possession of my family. These letters, the content of which has been elaborated by Professor Sugeeshwara Gunaratna and P.R. Jayasinghe in the Sinhala book Anagarika Dharmapala Saha Deva Priyawalisinghe, meaning Anagarika Dharmapala and Deva Priyawalisinghe, shows the depth of the trust and confidence placed by Anagarika Dharmapala in Deva Priyawalisinghe and the close relationship between these two great men. It was therefore no wonder that Walisinghe, since the passing away of Venerable Devamitra Dharmapala in 1933, until his death in 1968, carried forward the work of the Mahabodhi Society as its General Secretary. It must also be said that in 1928, Walisinghe came to London with 3 bhikkhus, sacrificing his postgraduate studies in Calcutta, and remained in England for 2 years. His primary work undertaken as per the vision of Anagarika Dharmapala to give the Dhamma to the British was the establishment of the British Mahabodhi Society and to lay the London Buddhist Vihara on a firm footing. These 3 Buddhist monks whom Walisinghe accompanied, Venerable Paravahara Vajranyana, Venerable Deigaspe Panyasara, and Venerable Hagoda Nandasara, were the first Buddhist monks of the London Buddhist Vihara. Ladies and gentlemen, it is primarily through the service rendered in the propagation of the message of the Buddha to the entire world that the influence of Anagarika Dharmapala continues to be remembered in the world today, in countries such as the United Kingdom and elsewhere. And it is this light of the Dhamma that continues to be lit by institutions such as the London Buddhist Vihara, the oldest Theravada Buddhist temple in the Western Hemisphere, as well as generations of venerable Theros and laymen who continue to keep alive the flame of this unique treasure trove of knowledge and practice on the mind-body, its cyclical existence, impermanent nature of its functioning, and the method to seize it. This spirit is captured by Anagarika Dharmapala in a speech he delivered in New York. I quote, "When the early Buddhist bhikkhus went forth to distant lands to preach the good law, they went relying on the power of righteousness, and they were prepared to face death at the hands of the people to whom they preached the sweet law of righteousness, peace, happiness, and love. China, Burma, Ceylon, Siam, Japan, Tibet, and other distant lands were brought under the good law of the compassionate one, not with the help of gunboats, but by the power of love of self-sacrificing bhikkhus." Given the current interest in Buddhist practices in the West, including in Britain, the foresight and wisdom of Anagarika Dharmapala is captured in a letter written by him in 1926, expressing his intention to introduce the Dhamma to the English people. I quote, "There are thousands of liberal-minded, educated Englishmen to whom the doctrine of the Aryans must be preached. The English are a great race, and as such, they should not be allowed to die of spiritual inanition. The English should be made to hear the Arya Dharma of the great teacher of the Sakya race." He wrote in his diary on 1st January 1926, as he sailed the Atlantic from United States to England, "May the Sasana be established in England. 1300 years ago, the Roman clergy established the Catholic Church in England. In the 16th century, Henry VIII established the Protestant Church. Why should not England also have the Aryan religion of the Sakya prince? Today, there are around 54 Buddhist temples here in the UK, over half of which are of Sri Lankan origin. It is a great source of satisfaction that the London Buddhist Vihara, as the pioneer institution, continues to spread the light of Asia in this land. As the London Buddhist Vihara completes 90 years of its existence, let me conclude by wishing the current generation of venerable Theros in the Vihara the courage of one's convictions and the strength of the triple gem in carrying out one's sacred duty of disseminating the luminous rays of the Dhamma in this land. Thank you.
I think Mr. Sugeeshwara Gunaratna deserves a second round of applause. Venerable Bogoda Silvimala, Anagarika of London Buddhist Vihara and Sanganayaka of Great Britain, Venerable monks, Mr. Sugeeshwara Gunaratna, Mrs. Gunaratna, Mrs. Mala Veerasekara, grandniece of Anagarika Dharmapala, and friends in the Dhamma. It is my honor and pleasure to give the vote of thanks today. I would like to start by a comment made by Michelle Obama. She said recently, when our opponents go lower, we go higher. That is really appropriate for what Sugeeshwara told us today. Because Anagarika Dharmapala would have faced the most ignominious insults and probably come close to death many times, both in Sri Lanka and in India. The colonial masters wouldn't have treated him kindly. The Brahmins who were at Bodh Gaya didn't even give him a place to sleep. He slept vertically inside a hollow of a tree during the first week of his first visit to India. We can admire him for his courage, fortitude, and determination to get the Buddhist sites in India revitalized, as well as bring Buddhism to the West, where the colonial masters had really put Buddhism on the back burner and in fact tried to annihilate it completely. I applaud Sugeeshwara for his depth of research and his ability to communicate. It is very rare for us to get someone who can do research as well as present it in a manner that is acceptable to all of us. We have had memorial lectures for the last few years. This is probably the best memorial lecture so far. Well done, Sugeeshwara. We must not forget his relative and his ancestry. It's probably why we are so close to Anagarika Dharmapala and his movement. Devapriya Valisingh, as he said, some are born to serve underneath the master, with the masters who get all the limelight, but they are preserved in service for a very long time, and probably through their entire lives. We know many such people who serve and serve and serve. They never get any limelight, but yet the masters get all the limelight. But Devapriya Valsingh's influence on his life is very apparent when he speaks to us. And Devapriya Valsingh was as great a person as Anagarika Dharmapala because he carried on the work regardless after Anagarika Dharmapala passed away in 1933. It is amazing when you think the amount of opportunities that Anagarika Dharmapala got, starting with the advent of Henry Steele Olcott and Madame Blavatsky to Sri Lanka, and recruiting him at the tender age of 16 to the Theosophical Society. And his speech in Chicago, which Sugeeshwara talked about, and the response and the reception of that speech by the Americans and by the Western leaders. And also, if you consider, on his way back from Chicago, he met Sir Edwin Arnold, who wrote The Light of Asia. What better luck than that? And in 1924, he met Christmas Humphreys, who started the Buddhist Society, and together they were able to launch London Buddhist Vihara. If you consider how many troubles and travails London Buddhist Vihara has gone through in its 90 years, there were some days in which there was no money for food, no money, not enough money to pay the bills, the utility bills, but still they survived. He was a survivor and he was a winner. There was no way that he was ever going to take no for an answer. It just wasn't in his vocabulary. So I would like to thank Sugeeshwara again for this wonderful lecture, and long may our work continue we are all inspired by our founder. And we can look forward to the 100th anniversary, which is just 10 years away. And may all of you be able to come for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.